My approach, how it has to be. How one makes sense of the world, muddling through. An unbroken and undivided whole movement, an attempt to play, to transgress the logic of poetry or painting, the visceral effect of a spell-making practice, not language, muscle, blood, and breath, rooted in poetry. Dropping threads, tentacular ideas, connecting, disconnecting, and reconnecting. Mycelial existence will ultimately dissolve. My approach here is philosophically in keeping with the phenomenological preoccupation with subjective experience and the inherent subjectivity of making art. Of course my point of view is subjective, but that is how it has to be in art. In his work, the artist breaks down reality in the prism of his perception and uses a foreshortening technique of his own to show different sides of reality. In his exploration of the poetic imagination, phenomenologist Gaston Bachelard writes of how he first tried to consider images without attempting personal interpretation, in accordance with the values of his previous focus, the philosophy of science. But little by little, this method, which has in its favour scientific prudence, seemed to be an insufficient basis on which to found a metaphysics of the imagination. This is even more the case when considering a basis on which to found the application of the imagination, making art, which in my view can include academic writing by artists. We are, after all, not critics or historians of art, but makers of art. In Kentridge's definition, a demonstration of how one makes sense of the world, rather than an instruction of what the world means. However, as Bachelard writes, to say that one has left certain intellectual habits behind is easy enough. But how is it to be achieved? How would it look, feel, sound, to take the academic essay as a form and use it to create a work of art? Like Bachelard, I also had a previous life in the sciences, and I think that the scientific approach can supply a way forward in one respect. Quantum physicist Richard Feynman argued that muddling through is the most scientific way of progressing. Figuring out as you go along is, perhaps, also the most artistic way of progressing, in tune with my what-if experimental approach to making art. Also, in accordance with quantum physicist David Bohm, here I do not make a sharp distinction between the act of perception and experimentation, and the activity of communicating verbally about what we have observed and done. All of these are regarded as sides or aspects of an unbroken and undivided whole movement, which are closely related, both in function and in content. I will return to this idea of an unbroken and undivided whole movement throughout this essay, or more accurately, assay. This is an attempt, an experiment. In order to play with the essay as art, I must transgress. However, in setting great store by the subjective view of the artist, I am not making a plea for an arbitrary or anarchic approach. It is a question of worldview, of ideals and moral ends. My experiment does not demonstrate a lack of love for the academic form, or a lack of respect for logical argument. Respect for the proper functions of the academic form and formal logic requires that they should not be misapplied to a task for which they are not suited. As per the principle in both biology and architecture, form follows function, and the form of an academic text is specific to its function of rational, evidence-based discourse within the academy. Professors of psychology, Brady Wagner and Vlad Glaveanu, state that approaching the mind as a logical processor of discrete symbols has clearly led to the neglect of fundamental features of human life. And I argue likewise that traditional academic writing has led to the neglect of fundamental modes of human understanding. I'm not rejecting logic and rationality. I'm allowing space for the simultaneous emergence of other forms of logic. As explained by poet and translator Robert Bringhurst, the logic of narrative differs from that of deductive analysis. It also differs from the imagistic logic of poetry or painting, from the logic of musical phrases, themes, and keys, and from the logic of growth and structure, or the logic of behavior in vertebrates, cycads, or crustaceans. All of these and more, it seems to me, are real and legitimate forms of logic. The logic I primarily utilize here is a poetic logic, what Tarkovsky calls associative linking. The usual logic, that of linear sequentiality, is uncomfortably like the proof of a geometry theorem. As a method, it is comparably less fruitful artistically than the possibilities opened up by associative linking, which allows for an affective as well as rational appraisal. Like Bringhurst, all I have ever asked a theory to do is help me, like a bowline or a compass, get from one ledge or campsite to another. If it also tells me where to find true north, of course I'm grateful, yet I don't suppose that any north is permanently true, or that it could or should be. My primary transgression should be obvious by now. The academic form is rooted in text, and I'm speaking. Text and speech are not the same form, or, speaking as an artist, the same medium. Writing changes language. It halts it in its tracks and lets us edit and dissect the words we speak. And by liberating the text from the page, it is free from fixation, from the hold of the eye. Unlike writing, speech has, in the words of artist Eglu Budvitite, the visceral effect of the voice on the nervous system of the receiver. She is interested in using language as a spell-making practice, as a tool to organize the world, and spells, just like poetry, song, and performance, are meant to be spoken, not written, and this so-called essay is perhaps all those things. I also transgress the traditional form by pairing my speech with moving images, rather than the static, discreetly located figures of academic tradition. Additionally, my simultaneous layered video footage provides other modes of information, an equal but different form of research, one that does not rely on language. I do this to emphasize that language has been raised above its station, misconceived as a kind of money with which meaning is conferred. The great blue heron and the pole star and the larch tree, the future and the past, the beating heart, the incidents of love and the memories of lovers, must be converted to the currency of language so our words can make them true. This view of language is intentional delusion. I defy this delusion by allowing the free associative linking of footage of my environment and my artistic media with the words I am speaking. My next transgression regards citation. I don't speak the citations. They appear on screen simultaneous with their quotes because linguistic rhythms are rooted in physiological rhythms, in muscle, blood, and breath, which are rooted in the air and in the ground. Bringhurst, 2008, 28. You can hear how the spoken citation is not natural to these physiological rhythms. The final transgression I draw your attention to relates to definitions. I'm not defining my terms in the traditional sense because in natural languages there is no direct one-to-one relation between objects and the signs used to designate them. On the contrary, this relationship is one-to-many or, even more, many-to-many. I'm allowing multiple potential meanings to exist at once, as in poetry, to reveal and enhance this multiplicity, to make connections between different spheres of meaning, to open new spaces for imagining and experiencing the world. In accordance with my approach to definitions, I'm adopting the acronym SF used by philosopher Donna Haraway, for which she gives multiple definitions. Speculative feminism, string figures, science fiction, speculative fabulation, and science fact. SF is a kind of worlding, a kind of story-making with deep materialities that work through relays and knottings and dropping threads, and somebody else picking a thread, and a mutation and a pattern happening that you didn't intend, that perhaps ruins the pattern, that perhaps also suggests something interesting and fun and better. I also embrace Haraway's concept of the Cthulhu scene, the tentacular, multi-temporal, multi-spatial past, present, and yet to come. Not either in anyone's control, nor is it some kind of uniquely human-generated world, but human beings are in this world. These ideas reflect the complexity of being and what it feels like, to me at least, to make art, something that is an inherent human act, but not necessarily limited to humans. The sense of entanglement in SF and the Cthulhu scene brings to mind the concept of the rhizomatic, introduced by theorists Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. A rhizome ceaselessly establishes connections between semiotic chains, organizations of power, and circumstances relative to the arts, sciences, and social struggles. And the rhizome connects any point to any other point, and its traits are not necessarily linked to traits of the same nature. This is akin to actor network theory, which, according to philosopher Bruno Latour, claims that modern societies cannot be described without recognizing them as having a fibrous, thread-like, wiry, stringy, ropey, capillary character that is never captured by the notions of levels, layers, territories, spheres, categories, structure, systems. Whenever I consider the concept of the rhizome, I feel a more appropriate metaphor would be mycelium, the fungal hyphae that mesh, connecting, disconnecting, and reconnecting within and between organisms, as described by mycologist Merlin Sheldrake in his book Entangled Life. I would extend the metaphorical mycelial concept of Deleuze and Guattari and Latour beyond modern human societies to all of existence. We are, after all, as enmeshed with the non-human world as the human one. In Dark Ecology, Morton criticizes magical forms of differentiation, such as the rhizomatic, as being post-structuralist fantasies that seek to do away with the strange, bumpy divisions between things. But in a later book, All Art is Ecological, they recognize the unavoidable interconnectedness of everything we know and understand, and everything we can't know or see too. This brings me again to Bohm. Each autonomous and relatively stable structure is to be understood not as something independently and permanently existent, but rather as a product that has been formed in the whole flowing movement, and that will ultimately dissolve back into this movement.